everyone. Today I am going to be briefly discussing my favorite classical composers. I find classical music to be actually very interesting and very insightful, and it actually allows me, I think, to do my work faster when I'm going through the internet and doing a process that involves some kind of work or labor on the internet, or just kind of work in general. Probably not necessarily reading, but when it comes to doing something, I feel like it allows me to do the work a lot faster. I think a lot of people get some kind of stimulus with it when they do homework, and I think it just provides an interesting amount of emotion that allows people to maybe look at themselves through a different perspective, or bring out certain emotions within a person. And really, classical music is really the basic, I would say, large foundation that really started music as a entertainment form. I think you could argue that, yes, there has been music out before sort of the classical kind of period, between like 1600s to 1800s, but it seems like the ability for music to flourish and to be, I guess, maybe widely available to future generations has come through this period, and I think it's only appropriate to kind of discuss some of the composers that made this era kind of possible in moving forward with music. Now, the first person I'm going to briefly discuss is Mozart, Wolfgang Mozart. And the interesting thing about Mozart is that although his music is somewhat powerful and epic and sometimes whimsical, he didn't seem to have that presence in real life, because he was a lot smaller than a lot of his other acquaintances and friends. He was almost this he was almost this very just kind of fragile looking but yet eccentric kind of personality. He might seem small, but he's just full of life and full of energy. There's this film that sort of addresses this eccentric side of him. If you watch Amadeus, where he's just kind of laughing and being goofy, and it might be a little bit over the top maybe from what Mozart actually was in real life, but I think a lot of his personality comes through within his music. I think it's always very big, and it's always very bold, and it usually builds up from something. It's just very powerful. It has this energy, and I think that energy comes through in how he was as a person, and how he wanted to ultimately express himself in some kind of powerful way, and I think he did that through his music. And he's just very big. He's very bold, and you really do see this within the Amadeus film, but I think it's just naturally within Mozart's music in general that makes him sort of stand out and be this very powerful composer. Even though he was maybe a little bit meek and small, there was still a lot to his personality that allowed him to generate this success and power through his music. Unfortunately, though, later on within his life, he started to have financial problems. I think there was a war going on at some point, and this made it hard for a lot of musicians to gain money, and have a steady income, and he eventually fell ill, and that unfortunately resulted in the end of his life. And it seems like a lot of these composers suffered from illness throughout their lives, and illness was really big during this time period from 1600s to 18 and 1900s, because we did not have modern medicine. So it really does have a profound impact, I think, on people's lives. This this condition of illness, and it did unfortunately affect Mozart, but I think his music still lives on, and I think it's his personality and his eccentric nature that allowed him to compose such music. And he started at a very young age, like a lot of the other composers that I'm going to mention, and I think this allowed him to gain a sense of knowledge and a sense of talent, and I think it worked to ultimately his advantage, and he's remembered now, and I think he sort of dedicated his life to music. So can't have a music discussion without mentioning Mozart at some point, so I figured I would mention him. So I would describe his music as the more whimsical and dramatic kind of music, and is very powerful and always full of energy as well. Now Beethoven, the next person that I'm going to mention on this list of my favorite composers, being classical composers, is that he's very different from Mozart. He has a very somber, kind of brooding approach to music. His Moonlight Sonata is a perfect example of a contrast in regards to what Mozart was sort of doing with his music. Beethoven sort of lived the life of again learning music at a fairly young age. He also received a lot of women that have ultimately rejected him in some way, shape, or form. Now, it's not to say that the women themselves rejected him. From what I could research, it was mostly the fact that he was from a different class than the women that he liked and wanted to ultimately marry. And it's happened to him kind of like on multiple occasions. So it's unfortunate, but it was always usually the family members or who would say, no, we don't want you, Beethoven, having our daughter, so sorry. So I think this really ate away at him, and I think he did suffer from this kind of maybe loneliness from it. And I think Moonlight Sonata really sort of highlights that sense of loneliness and depression. And he also, again, was suffering from hearing problems relatively early on in his life. And I think actually nobody necessarily knows, I guess, the exact condition that he had with his ear, what exactly made it that he couldn't hear as well anymore. But regardless, it's kind of it just kind of shows you how he sort of deals with music in a different way than Mozart did. There's also a sense of it being a little bit more softer, the music. It's not intended to be this powerhouse of energy and life. It's really it's soft. It's mellow. It's not designed to be so I think traditionally classical. I think Beethoven was a little bit more I think Beethoven really, wanted to just kind of distinguish himself. And I think this kind of brooding, kind of somber approach allowed him to do that. And I think he just stands out as one of the great composers of our time, regardless of it not being, his pieces as not being as powerful or as energetic as Mozart's. Again, I think it's all based upon what you prefer. in regards to classical music, but I still think Beethoven offered something really unique, and I think his music will hopefully live on for the next generations. Now, the next one I'm going to mention very briefly is Chopin. I always get this name wrong. I can never pronounce his name correctly. I apologize if this is completely wrong. But Chopin actually was, I think from my research, it said that he was originally from Warsaw, and then he eventually moved to France and gained citizenship there, and I find that interesting too. There's also some other composers who've done this, which I'll kind of mention later. But basically, the difference in regards to Chopin and Beethoven and Mozart is that he doesn't have necessarily the power and energy or the brooding sense, or he doesn't have the brooding sense of Beethoven, and he doesn't have the high volume energy like Mozart, but he does have this soothing, relaxing kind of approach where he kind of takes things and makes it really relaxing, soothing, elegant. There's a certain way that he approaches things that's just kind of mellow, but not in a kind of depressing, I guess, sense. I almost feel Chopin, or I apologize if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, had this way of approaching music where it brings out all these different other emotions. I feel like it seems like he was the type of person who enjoyed the soothing relaxation that music provided, and he seemed to like that aspect a whole lot and seemed to emphasize that, I think, within his music. I believe it's also noted that he did suffer again illness. I think Beethoven, though, did suffer illness, but more later on during his life. Chopin, I think, had some illnesses earlier on, and that probably could have impacted his way of maybe his style of music. Either it could have or it couldn't have, but I think that there is this relaxing approach that he has that allows the listener to sort of take it easy and enjoy the surroundings and atmosphere. He kind of does bring out, I think, certain things that are very oriented in trying to be background music, but in a sense be at the forefront when it comes to the emotion of releasing tension, releasing energy, and just kind of letting it drift away and sail, and just it's kind of, his music's almost like a way of letting go of whatever is bothering somebody. At least it's how I sort of envision his approach. But I think that's all I can really say in regards to Chopin and how I feel about his music in particular. Now, the next artist that I'm going to mention is another famous one, Handel. If you've heard of Messiah, the Hallelujah, 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 that's him, in case you didn't know. But the interesting thing about Handel is he does have this sort of epic quality similar to Mozart. There is this kind of similarity to them in that they try to be very suave, and they kind of try to appeal to the traditional kind of classical music. I feel Beethoven and Chopin are more of like the alternative kind of classical music, and Handel and Mozart are kind of in that same camp of being very epic and grand and sophisticated and suave. I think the difference with Handel is that a lot of his pieces, I think, are centered on having some kind of religious, cultural significance, especially since throughout his life he's sort of performed in churches and has been a part of churches. Like, if you look up his whole bio, pretty much he's gone from one church to the other church to another church, blah, 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 blah. And he has received training again from a young age. And he does have this sense of, I guess, having this cultural experience with these various churches that he's been a part of and have performed. And he was originally an organ player. I believe that's actually where he kind of started his sort of music career, I guess you could say. And it only makes sense that, most churches have organs. So where else is he going to perform but in a church? And I think there is this kind of religious, maybe, influence that he's had, especially when you listen to Messiah, and it's all very preachy and, very, very epic and grand, and so much spectacle to it. I think Handel's is based on trying to be, cultural and the interesting thing too is that it's I think also being culturally influenced by the various churches that he's performed at. He's also I think influenced from the various different kinds of countries as well, like France and Germany and Italy as well. I think he's taken inspiration from all these different cultures too, and has sort of allowed that to kind of flow through his music. And I think there was a lot of influence in Europe during the time, at least this kind of sense of multiculturalism, because, again, Europe was sort of kind of trying to kind of build itself up, and you had to have all of these relations, especially when they sort of border each other, and have various influences towards each other. So it only makes sense that I think that's incorporated within certain composers' work, and I think Handel in particular was one who liked to sort of do that. So I think ultimately, though, that's really all I can say about Handel, but I think his music is unique in the sense that, again, he does try to combine cultural elements, and he does have this sort of religious cultural influence that kind of goes through his works. But regardless of that, I think it's still worth noting that there is a lot of grandeur to his work, and I think that grandeur, I think distinguishes him maybe from Mozart, who was more about being whimsical and epic and dramatic, and Handel was more of on that same level, but in a more grandeur, godly-like sense. Whereas Mozart, I think, is a little bit more. Mozart's music is maybe a little bit more humanistic. But ultimately, I think that's really all I can mention in regards to Handel. Now, the next one that I'm going to briefly discuss is Bach. And I think Bach, too, had this sort of religious kind of influence. And he did have sort of a similar thing with Handel, like combining sort of styles and things like that. And actually, I think it was Bach that I apologize. It was Bach that that originally played the organ to start off with, and I think he had actually more church influence than maybe necessarily Handel did. I think Handel was actually the one who was more based in opera. Bach, I think, was more religious based and moved around to various churches and performed there. So I apologize for the mistake there. It's kind of sometimes hard to tell between the composers because sometimes you can't really distinguish their styles because they really do kind of adopt from one another. But Bach, I think, is interesting in the sense of, again, combining sort of the styles, being that composer that's sort of drawn influence from other composers. I ultimately can't. It's hard for me to distinguish, I think, between Bach and Handel, because I think they both kind of have this similar quality, this kind of grandeur, maybe, to speak. But I think they're both really well done or really good composers. So with that being said, I think they both have a aspect to them that makes them stand out. But I would say that I think those are the two that do have a very similar style and a similar approach, at least from what I can tell from listening to them. Now, the second to last one that I am going to mention is Tchaikovsky. The Swan Lake and the Sleeping Beauty, those kinds of works I think are really interesting because with a composer like Tchaikovsky, there is this element of storytelling and this aspect of putting in music within storytelling that doesn't involve words, that I think is just so powerful and so interesting, that I think it really works to present emotions within the story. And I really like that aspect about Tchaikovsky, and I like how he can do that with his ballets. And I think it really works to his advantage, and I just think it's interesting how he as a composer has made works that are more generated to telling stories and being based in on those emotions of the stories. So I think that's what makes his work stand out in particular. I think there's this sense of him focusing on fairy tales, focusing on emotion instead of reality, that makes his music very appealing. I think there's just a lot that he has to offer as a composer, and I think the storytelling aspect really adds a lot of value to his work and gives his music sort of a context. So I guess that's why I would say I enjoy Tchaikovsky in particular. Now, the next one and last one that I'm going to mention is Vivaldi. And his music is very dreamlike. It has that sort of whimsy, maybe like Mozart's, except it's I think focused on trying to be very it's almost like it's trying to create a painting, maybe not necessarily like a story, but maybe a painting or some. His music feels like it's trying to create something artistic. It's it's not like Mozart that's about grabbing your attention and grabbing your you by your emotions. With Vivaldi, it's about kind of just taking you somewhere, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a story like Tchaikovsky's music, but it's of a kind of journey through through an art piece, or through something that is maybe not of this world but can come from your mind. So again, kind of like a dream. And that's why I think I would put his music in sort of that kind of category and that kind of feel, at least. But those, I think, are really all the composers that I would like to mention. And I apologize for getting Bach and Handel's sort of story mixed up again. Handel is very sophisticated and epic, and sort of leans more on towards the classical styles of Mozart. But again, he does have this sort of religious undertone within his work, as well as his work being heavily focused on being opera oriented. And he was actually one who traveled, and he had an illness, I think, eventually later on in his life, and he went to London to compose for, I think it was the Queen during that time, and for like the aristocratic people within that time within England. And I think he actually did stay in England for the rest of his life. But Bach is the one who combined a lot of various different cultural styles, who started out as an organ player and went through various churches and had a lot of sort of church influence. So that's really what distinguishes sort of his work. But ultimately, that's all I think I can say in regards to these composers. I'll be sure to put lists below where you can listen to their music, and I'll make sure that they're like really long ones so that you can kind of go through whatever you would like to listen to, and figure out what you enjoy the most. But ultimately, I think that's really all I can say. But if there are any questions, comments, concerns, I'd be more than happy to answer them. But until next time, everybody,